Stagflation is crushing global economies, including the United States. Is it going to be worse than the 1970s? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the Phillips curve, or maybe better said, the Phillips curve fail. The Phillips curve epic fail going back to the 1970s. But the Phillips curve itself was this kind of wonky economic theory that inflation and unemployment had an inverse relationship. So if the unemployment rate went down, inflation, consumer price inflation, would naturally go up. So moving over to the chart, the lower horizontal line represents the unemployment rate. We go from 3% to 8%. On the left, the vertical line, we go from 2% to 8%. That represents consumer price inflation, or the CPI. So if unemployment is at 6%, well, the theory states that inflation should be around 2%. But if unemployment goes down to, let's say, 3%, then inflation should go up to, let's say, 5%. But the key here is what we saw in the 1970s is we had inflation and unemployment going up at the same time. So technically, there's kind of 3 main components of stagflation. You have high rates of unemployment, high rates of consumer price inflation, and negative real GDP growth. So high consumer price inflation, while at the same time, the economy is actually contracting. Now, a lot of you watching this video right now are saying, yeah, George, I get it, but do we really have stagflation right now in the global economies, especially the United States, when the unemployment rate is actually very low? And I would argue, yes, we do, because the 2 most important things, in my opinion, is high rates of consumer price inflation and negative real GDP growth. And we're seeing that play out right now in Q1, Q2 of 2022, where the most recent CPI print was 8.5%, and the most recent GDP numbers, real GDP, was negative 1.4%. So all the talking heads on CNBC and Bloomberg and Jerome Powell himself is saying how strong the economy is, while at the exact same time, the economy is literally contracting. A perfect example of this economic Orwellian doublespeak that has become, unfortunately, so popular in the mainstream media. But the whole point of this step is to show that we had the Phillips curve prior to the 1970s, and the hypothesis was that there was an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. But what the 1970s showed us is that this was complete economic nonsense because inflation and unemployment went up at the same time. And throughout the rest of this video, I'll show you how the new form of stagflation, which I think we are experiencing in the United States right now, could be even worse than what we experienced in the 1970s. Step number 2. Now let's go over the EDquattata curve, otherwise known as the EDquattata curve. Now, you may be asking yourself, George, what on earth does that stand for? I've never heard of that curve before, and I have my PhD in economics. Well, let me go ahead and enlighten you. It stands for economists don't know what they are talking about curve. And we illustrate that perfectly in step number 1, where Milton Friedman came out and said, I told you Keynesians didn't know what you were talking about. That Phillips curve is nonsense. It's all about money supply. Don't you know that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon? It's what Milton Friedman taught us back in the 1970s. But the Krugman types come in and say, damn you, Friedman, we'll get you back. Okay, fine. Our beloved Phillips curve didn't work, but we'll go ahead and adjust it a little bit. And although we won't come out with an official curve this time, because we don't want to make ourselves look foolish if it doesn't pan out, we'll do the same type of thing where we've got a horizontal line at the bottom that represents the unemployment rate. But on the left, this vertical line, instead of representing inflation, well, it's actually going to represent economic growth now. So, this is obvious, right? As the unemployment rate goes down, well, then economic growth, economic output, economic activity, or real GDP growth would most likely expand. So what you have is, instead of an inverse relationship between the level of unemployment and inflation, now they'll say, okay, well, there's at least an inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and the economic output. So again, as the unemployment rate goes down, the economy grows or does better. We have more economic activity. But what has happened recently? It's the EDquattata Curve has presented itself to the Krugman types. And now they don't know what to do, because the curve is completely inverted, if you will, or it's the complete opposite, meaning that when we had 5% unemployment, call it a year ago, we had economic output or real GDP at about 1%. And as the unemployment rate has gone down, so has GDP. Just like we went over in step number 1, currently the unemployment rate is very low, but we just had a negative 1.4% GDP print. So we have low unemployment, but the economy is contracting. We have less economic activity and less economic output. So then the question becomes how? How on earth can this happen? How can we have lower and lower rates of unemployment, and at the same time, our economy gets smaller and smaller and smaller? We have more people working, but yet we're producing far less stuff. This, my friends, is the key. Step number 3, for us to really get our heads around the probabilities of the 2020s being even worse than the 1970s when it comes to stagflation, we have to understand what's happening right now with worker productivity in the United States. Editor, go ahead and cut to this headline from CNBC. And we see that labor productivity fell 7.5% in the first quarter. And that's the biggest decline since 1947. So what this means is the American worker is producing far, far less goods and services. This is consistent with the GDP showing us that the economy is contracted by 1.4%. And I think this is also reflected in the trade deficit. Let's look at a chart going back to 2018 all the way to today's date. On the left, we go from a negative $120 billion per month up to a negative $40 billion per month. So going back to 2018, our trade deficit was about $40 billion per month. And I've kind of smoothed out the curve. The editor can go ahead and throw up the exact chart. But going into 2021, it really starts to plummet. And then in 2022, it absolutely tanks. It goes from maybe $70 billion a month down to where it is today at almost $120 billion a month. So what this tells us is that we are producing way, way less than we are actually consuming. Not a good foundation for economic growth, or at least sustainable economic growth in the future. But I also want to point out the labor force participation is extremely low. And I think this is due to asset prices being so high. The S&P 500, with the exception of the last few months, has gone straight up since the cerveza sickness, since March of 2020. So if the stock market, the NASDAQ, is going straight up, if cryptocurrency, the market cap, is going from 1 trillion to 2 trillion, then a lot more people are going to feel rich, especially when you combine this with the housing market going straight up. So if people feel rich, they think they don't have to go back to work. So the young people delay getting a job again. They're just living off their stimmy checks in their Dogecoin, let's say. And the older folks, they say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and retire early. But let's think this through. What have we seen in the NASDAQ since November of 2021? It's pretty much gone straight down. And we've really seen some volatility to the downside over the last couple weeks. So if we continue to see the stock market plummet along with cryptocurrency, and we get some weakness in the housing market, the purchasing power of the average American could be greatly reduced. Now, for a moment, let's go back to step number one. Remember, the technical definition of stagflation is where you have high unemployment, you also have high consumer price inflation, and you have negative real economic growth, or negative real GDP. But today, we have low unemployment. But what does that unemployment number represent? It really represents purchasing power. So I believe even if we continue to have low rates of unemployment, and we'll get into some reasons why in a moment, we're going to have a serious reduction in the purchasing power if the stock market continues to decline, which I think it will, because I think the Fed is going to continue to raise rates until they really do some damage to the stock market, because that's, in their mind, the only way to get the consumer price inflation down without taking interest rates to a level which would completely destroy the economy, producing potentially a global economic collapse. So my point is, even if we have low unemployment today, we have the exact same conditions we had in the 1970s. In other words, we have very high consumer price inflation, we have lower purchasing power for the average American, and we have negative real GDP. But there are other factors at play. Like I said earlier, the labor force participation has been going down. So that unemployment number really doesn't truly represent the amount of Americans that are working. And going back to shadow stats, they highlight the fact that if we measured the unemployment rate like we did in the 1970s, the unemployment rate would not be 3%. It would be closer to maybe 7 or 8%, maybe even higher. Another thing I think is incredibly important that nobody is talking about is we could go from a labor shortage to a labor surplus. Let's go back to some of the reasons why I think the labor force participation is very low, meaning asset prices. So if the stock market goes down by, let's say, 50%, and if cryptocurrency continues to go down, and like we said earlier, if the housing market starts going down, especially the prices go down in nominal terms, well, all those people are going to rush back into the labor market, and we go from that labor shortage that has kept the unemployment rate very low to a labor surplus. So even measured by the government's phony numbers that we have in 2022, the unemployment rate goes from 3%, let's say, to 8%, to 10%, to 12%. And that puts us right back where we were in the 1970s, where we do have stagflation as defined by, well, he's gone, but the Paul Krugman types. So these are the main reasons why I think we've been seeing the EDquattata Curve. Or economists don't know what they are talking about curve. Unemployment going down, but economic growth also going down to the point where it's actually negative. So what is a timeline? And we haven't talked about it in this video. Going back to these asset prices going down, we know that the yield curve, the 2s and 10s, inverted a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now. And usually, if history is any indication, when the yield curve actually steepens, that's when we get the recession. So I think we'll get this recession maybe in 6 months to 18 months. It'll last through maybe the 24-month period or 36-month period if it's extremely severe. But while the recession is happening, I think the Fed takes rates right back down to zero. They do more quantitative easing, probably more than we saw during the cerveza sickness. And the government comes out with CARES Act 2.0, which probably isn't $5 trillion. This time, it could be 7, 10, who knows, $15 trillion. The deficit, the budget deficit I'm talking about this time, explodes higher. And that's what takes us right back into this inflationary cycle or stagflationary cycle for the next few years and potentially for the entire decade of the 2020s. So to answer the question, do I think it's going to get worse than the 1970s? My answer would be yes. The bottom line is regardless of what the CPI is doing or what the government admits to as far as the CPI and the rate of inflation, we're going to have less economic activity, and the purchasing power for the average American is going to continue to decline. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I'll see you on the next video.